Okay, hope everyone had a wonderful Purim, and B'ezras Hashem, it should be a Zman of Geula, Yeshua. We go from the Purim, we go towards the month of Nisan, and Chazal say, "B'Nisan nigalu, v'Nisan asidin ligoel." In Nisan we were redeemed, and in Nisan is most likely, Mashiach can come any day, but it's most likely to be the month of the redemption. So, B'ezras Hashem, we hope that all of us and all of Klal Yisrael should experience HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Geula. So, we're going through the Devorah. We finished the halfway point, but the emes is the second half is going to go much, much faster than the first half. So, hopefully but we plan to finish relatively soon, although one could spend time to chazer it over and over again. Someone once asked Rav Bullman, I don't know if any of you know Rav Bullman. Rav Bullman used to be he's not alive anymore, one of the great Rabbanim in America. And he was the Mashgiach in Or Sameach for a number of years. Very, very great man. And somebody was very happy that they had finished Mesilas Yesharim for the first time, and they were very, very excited. And they went to Rav Bullman like, I finished Mesilas Yesharim. What should I do now? So he says, Baruch Hashem, you finished Mesilas Yesharim. So start from the beginning again, review it again. So Devorah is very, very similar, but right now we're trying to get through it the first time. And we're up to Perek Vav. Now again, this is the emulation of Svirais in order to connect to those divine energies, right? Hashem imitates us by our imitating Hashem. We call that double emulation. I imitate HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Midah as manifested in a Sphira, and that activates that Sphira and causes it to shine both on me and to some degree on the whole world. Double emulation. I imitate God, and God therefore imitates me. And if you remember, the Ramak doesn't connect it, but the Shalah and others connected to the idea, Hashem Tzilcha, Hashem is your shadow. Wherever you move is how the shadow responds. And this is a familiar idea in Chazal called Midah Keneged Midah. What I do is what Hashem does for me, or towards me. So the problem we have now is we're up to Midah number 2, which is the Midah of Gevura. This is actually, the second of the lower spheros. We have Keser, Chachma, Bina, but then which are called Mochin, God's brains. Now we have behavioral attributes, and we spent quite a long time on Chesed, which was a very, very long chapter. But now we come to Gevura. Now Gevura, we immediately have a certain problem here. Because Gevura, on a superficial level, seems to be the thing you want to avoid. Gevura is connected to din. Gevura is connected to punishment. Gevura is connected to judgment. Gevura is connected to paranios. So what's the pshat? I'm supposed to behave in a certain way that will magnify the Gevura in the world. Right? So the Ramak himself has a little bit of trouble with this because Gevura, lefi pshutai, is not something that you want to increase. And yet the whole thesis of the Devorah is, I emulate. Well, I guess it's true in the negative way. In other words, the thesis is still true. Whatever you emulate is what you'll get. So you behave in a harsh way, you'll get harshness. That happens to be true. But that's certainly not a desirable behavior, right? The Devorah is trying to tell us, how do we imitate the Sviros in order to connect to them in a positive way? So to simply make the statement, behave harshly and you will get a lot of Gevura. Well, okay, that's true. But that's not desirable. That's not what I want, right? So the Ramak has a bit of a problem with this, and he tries to fit it into his overall framework. And what he develops is a passage in the Zohar. And as the Ramak commonly does, he'll take a Zohar that's maybe only 2 lines, and he will construct his edifice based on those 2 lines. And the 2 lines are, now this is not in the Tikkunim, right? Tikkunei Zohar was the thesis of Perek Hey, who is a chassid, one who does chesed to Hashem. That's from Tikkunei Zohar. This is from the Zohar itself. And the Zohar says, The Yetzer Tov was created for you, and the Yetzer Hara was created for your wife. Now, what does that mean exactly? So it goes back to, and we talked about this a long time ago, maybe most of you weren't even here, in the Shema, right? It says in the Shema, V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha, you shall love Hashem, b'chol levavecha, with all of your heart, b'chol nafshecha, with all of your soul, u'b'chol ma'odecha, with all of your might. So, again, let's go over it very quickly. With all of your soul, that refers to the occasional obligation that sometimes a person must die before they betray HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Most of the time, that's not true. Most of the time, pikuach nefesh, you violate, it's not even a violation, you violate Shabbos and Kashrus, but there are times, called Yehareg V'al Yavor, that I must be willing to die, right? The common example is Avodah Zarah, that when I worship idols or I connect to another religion, what I'm doing is I am betraying the Almighty. I must be willing to give my life before I betray God. That's b'chol nafshecha. I'm sorry, b'chol, that's b'chol nafshecha. But what's the first one? B'chol levavcha, with all of your heart. So Rashi points out, again from the Sifri, that it could have said b'chol libecha, with all of your heart. What's levav? Now, levav is a biblical form for heart, but it's a bit of an anomalous form. Why the double? So Rashi brings bishnei yitzarecha. You must love God with both of your emotional inclinations. Love God with your Yetzer Tov, and love God with your Yetzer Hara. B'chol levavacha bishnei yitzarecha. Yetzer Tov, the Yetzer Hara. So the problem is, what does it mean to love God with my Yetzer Hara? Fakert, when I give in to my Yetzer Hara, I'm violating my obligations to God. So there are two explanations that are commonly given to how do I love God with my Yetzer Hara. One is, I love God with my Yetzer Hara by subduing my Yetzer Hara, by not giving in. Right? In other words, I love God by following my Yetzer Tov and doing mitzvos, and I love God by not giving in to the evil inclinations. According to that, serving God with the Yetzer Hara doesn't actually mean serving God with your Yetzer Hara, but it means serving God by not giving in to your Yetzer Hara. That's pshat number one. But there is a pshat number two, which is what the Ramak is going with. And that is, there is a bechina, there is a level of avodas Hashem with the Yetzer Hara itself. That you actually take the Yetzer Hara and you utilize it in positive ways. So an example would be, and this is what the Zohar means, that the Yetzer Tov was created for you, the Yetzer Hara was created for your wife. Now again, this happens to be a sexual imagery. Maybe it's not so appropriate for single people, but it's much broader than the particular context. That is, a person may have sexual urges. Now, to stamazai give in to them is improper. It's a wasting of seed, or it's other averos. Or if chas v'shalom, a person is boil and nida, they're chayav kares. And even if it's premarital sex with a woman that's not a nida, you're over on a lav, right? So the sexual urges can take you into all sorts of bad places. But if a person, within the context of marriage, uses those urges in order to fulfill a mitzvah, and those urges themselves are the motivation that pushes the person in the direction of the mitzvah, he has in effect utilized his Yetzer Hara to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then the Yetzer Hara becomes a constructive motivator because it puts him in a certain place that he might not have been without that Yetzer Hara. Now the truth of the matter is, the same is true for the general concept of doing mitzvahs shalom lishma, right? What does the Gemara in Pesachim say? One of the best known Gemaras, a person should learn Torah and do mitzvahs, even if it's not totally for the sake of heaven, shemitoch shelo lishma, because when you start off doing things for ulterior motives, the goodness of the mitzvah eventually takes you over and brings you to a higher madrega where you serve Hashem lishma. So what's an example? Let's say a person learns Torah because they find it to be intellectually fascinating. Right? They enjoy it. Or a person, right, so that's, I learned Torah because, it's intelligent. I enjoy debates. You can have people even if they're totally non-religious, and they enjoy Gemara. If you're a legal type scholar, not everybody is a legal mind, so to speak, but if you're a legal person, you'll enjoy it. You'll enjoy the types of things that Gemara talks about because they are legal. Oh yeah, we had that in law school or whatever it is, and the like. Reminds me of Justice Brennan's opinion in whatever it might be. So you're learning for intellectual content, intellectual enjoyment. Or a person might learn because they want to get respect. They want to be admired. They want people to know how smart they are. Now, those are not proper motivations in a sense. Those are Yetzer Hara motivations. One is the Yetzer Hara of Gaiva, pride. The other is the Yetzer Hara of at least not thinking about Hashem. But Chazal still say there's a legitimate role in those ulterior motives acting as motivators to a person. And initially, it motivates you because of bad reasons, or at least not the greatest reasons. And mitoch shelo lishma, ba lishma. It brings you to a level of lishma. In fact, Rav Chaim Volozhiner writes in the Nefesh HaChaim, much later than the Ramak, that he felt this was a big mistake early Hasidus was making that was potentially very destructive. He never mentions Hasidus by name, but he talks about a mistake that Mevakshe Hashem make. People who seek God, and it's very clear this was a buzzword for Hasidus. Everyone knows that. Hasidus very much stressed what you might call the internal dimension of Avodas Hashem, that you have to do mitzvahs out of love of God, reverence of God, l'shem shamayim. That was the basis of it. And they ridiculed people who were learning or doing mitzvahs for reasons other than serving Hashem. And as a result, at least the way Rav Chaim Volozhiner says, I don't know it directly, but the way he describes it, there were people who basically said, since I can't learn totally l'shem shamayim, I'm not going to learn, because my learning is puzzle, my learning is treif, my learning is illegitimate. What's the point of wasting my time on something that has no spiritual validity? Now, Rav Chaim Volozhiner says this was a mistake that certain Mavakshei Hashem had. If I can't do it right, then I'm not going to do it. He said, he writes in the Nefesh HaChaim, that this is a tremendous mistake. It is chas v'shalom, a tremendous mistake. And he goes through all the different reasons. Number one, we have Chazal's promise that mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma. Eventually you come to lishma. Number two, even if you don't come to lishma, there's an intrinsic value in doing good things. It's a separate point. In other words, it's not only because it'll come to lishma, but there's a value in the action itself. And number three, he makes the argument that even if a person is predominantly learning shelo lishma, efshar, that there are not going to be moments, maybe it's a minute, in which you're really thinking of God. Right? So, the fact that 95% of the time that's not in your kavanah, but there'll be a 1%. And then he has a shita, which, by the way, Rav Shneur Zalman says as well in the Tanya, that when you eventually learn Lishma, that it's Lamafreya, retroactively, all of the Torah you did Shelo Lishma gets elevated into the Madrega of Lishma. It's like it's waiting in suspended animation, and your Lishma liberates it, and it goes all the way up to Shemayim. So Rav Chaim Volozhiner said, It's a tremendous mistake to say, I will learn and do mitzvahs when I'm capable of a lishma, because Chazal tell us, mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma. So this, going back to the Ramak, this is all an example of how I use my Yetzer Hara to do good things. My desire for kavod, or even if it's a desire not to be embarrassed, which is not the same thing exactly, but I'm in yeshiva, right? So if I don't, my parents made me go, whatever, although that's probably not the situation for most of the Talmidim here. But, my parents made me go, I hate it here. But, I'm going to look like a real jerk if I don't, learn something. So that's a little different. So you're not learning for kavod. It's not that you want to be the genius of the yeshiva. You just don't want to be the jerk of the yeshiva. Okay. That too is not a great motivation, but it keeps you learning. It keeps you doing something. So Rav Chaim Volozhiner says we shouldn't laugh at these motivations, because these are lemaisa motivations that get us to a good place. Right? So this is an example, going back to the Ramak and to Kriya Shema. You serve God even with your Yetzer Haras, because the Yetzer Haras can be things that can motivate you when you otherwise would not be motivated by a higher ideal. In some ways, the Rambam himself writes that this is why the Torah itself emphasizes earthly rewards, right? The Torah says, keep the mitzvos and you'll have prosperity and you'll have health and you'll have success. And the Rambam says a person shouldn't do mitzvahs for those reasons. I don't do mitzvahs so God will bless me. So why does the Torah say God will bless you, if that's not the reason? So the Rambam says people need motivation. So in a sense, when I do mitzvahs for reward of any type, that is shelo lishma, but mitoch shelo lishma, ba lishma. Right? So this is a deeper idea. This is not I serve God with the Yetzer Hara by not giving into the Yetzer Hara. It's the other way around. I can serve God by giving into the Yetzer Hara when that Yetzer Hara is pushing me in motivation to do proper things. Mitoch shelo lishma, ba lishma. And in that way, and that's what the Zohar means, the Yetzer Hara was given for your wife's benefit, i.e., that when I use, let's say, that desire to fulfill my obligations towards my spouse, then the Yetzer Hara itself gets credit in the mitzvah that I do, and hu adin it would apply to any type of shelo lishma. So that's point number one. So point number one is using your Yetzer Hara in positive ways. In many ways, to take it a little further, without a Yetzer Hara, a lot of the great achievements of society wouldn't be there. What pushes a medical researcher to try to discover a cure for cancer? Meaning there is a reason why God put into the human personality notions of egotism, of wanting to accomplish, of wanting to be productive, of wanting to be creative. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be the most arrogant person in the world, but it means you need a certain amount of ego in order to accomplish. Otherwise, you kind of just look at yourself as, I'm a nobody. What does God expect of me to do in the world? So this is Yetzer Hara. So in some ways, you can even say further, the Yetzer Hara itself is not intrinsically evil. It is a faculty within me that can easily lead me astray. So it can lead me into evil, but it might in fact be a force for good. Now let me just digress for a moment on this Gemara in Pesachim. Mitoch shelo lishma, ba lishma. Mitoch shelo lishma, ba lishma. Tosfos asks an interesting kasha. There is another Gemara that says, when you learn Torah shelo lishma, it would have been better had you never been born. In fact, it even is more graphic. It says it would have been better if the umbilical cord would have strangled you as you came out of the womb, meaning you would have dead on arrival. So how could that be if indeed there's an idea, mitoch shelo lishma, ba lishma? So Tosfos says, somewhat surprisingly, that there are two types of shalol lishma. The shalol lishma, which is more or less kosher, at least b'di'evet, is I learned for wealth, although I'm not sure where learning will get you wealth, but okay, whatever it is. I learned for osher, I learned for kavod, I learned so people will admire me, or I learned not to be embarrassed. That's called shalol lishma, and on that there is a bechina mitoch shalol lishma, bal lishma. But then there's another type of shalol lishma, which is pernicious, bad, evil. That's when you learn with the deliberate attempt of wanting to shame or embarrass another person. Meaning, I'm learning because I want to show you up. I want to make you look bad. That's different than kavod. You see, if I'm learning because I want to be the best guy in the shir, okay, that's for kavod, mitoch shalol lishma bal lishma. But if I'm learning because I specifically want to embarrass you, that is what is called lekanter. Kuf nun tes reish, lekanter. And on that seems to be totally evil. There is no redemption in learning lekanter. Or another example would be, let's assume that a person is a Messianic Jew, and he's learning Tanakh and learning Gemaras for the purpose of wanting to take other people away from Judaism. Now, of course, that's shalol lishma, but it's much worse than that. It's not mitoch shalol lishma bal lishma. You don't say it on that. That's totally destructive. I think I told you my little story. Forgive me for digressing. It's a little bit of a Purim story almost, although it wasn't about Purim. That when I was in 9th or 10th grade, so we got Ner Yisrael, so we got word about some missionary group, Messianic Jews, were having a big get-together, open house in Baltimore, and they were inviting Jewish people to come and hear what's called the good news, about Yashka and everything else. So somebody in Ner Yisrael thought, let's organize a bunch of yeshiva guys to come to this meeting, kind of crash the meeting, and we would go over to people and say, would you like to know about authentic Judaism and the like, and here are some materials and the like. So we were given material, and we were even given a class about what to say. So we went there, and most of the people I went over to, I think most people had this reaction. They said, get out of here, what do you want from me? I'm here for Yashka. But finally, I got a guy, a big burly guy with a beard, and he was really, really interested. And he took notes. I was telling him this Gemara and that Gemara, and I was really proud of myself because I got a person, I saved him, mi ber shachas, etc. And he's taking notes, and he thanked me profusely. It turned out he was the head of the organization, and he wanted to hear all of these sources so he could then refute them or do his research and the like. So that was my last involvement in counter-missionary activity. But that would be an example of the counter. The KGB, it's amazing what in the old days of the Soviet Union, what they invested in. The KGB would when there were yeshivas in Russia, they would send KGB agents to be in yeshivas. They would teach them for 20 years. These guys knew Shas. I don't know. They wanted to make them so perfect to fit into the yeshiva. These guys spent 10 years learning. They send them in yeshiva and they're able to spy. Right? So that type of learning is that's not mitoch shalol lishma bal lishma. That's Tosfos Chiddush. Tosfos Chiddush is that if I do it for osher, for kavod, okay, that's mitoch shalol lishma bal lishma. If I do it b'dafka, to be machti people, to knock them down, to take them away from Yiddishkeit, or to humiliate them, that's nichlal in lekanter. And there it's better if the person would never have been born. Yeah.
There's a motivation, I fear, maybe we're afraid to say it, that sometimes we learn to not be humiliated. It is in we have shir, the rabbi's going to have a certain expectation.
Yeah.
We learn to not be humiliated.
For sure, yeah, for sure.
What does that tell
No, that's shalol lishma. That's not, in other words, that is a legitimate motivator of shalol lishma. I'm learning because I don't want to be embarrassed. Okay. Is it the highest level? No. But is it nichlal in mitoch shalol lishma, bal lishma? 100%. So so of course, let that be your motivation. And in that way, let me use my Yetzer Hara to serve Hashem. Now, Just to give you an example, how that same Yetzer Hara could turn into a bad thing. Meaning, if I learn because I don't want to be embarrassed, so that's mitoch shelo lishma bo lishma. But if I don't ask questions because I don't want to be embarrassed, that's giving into the Yetzer Hara, as Pirkei Avos says, lo habaishan lamed. The person who is embarrassed to ask questions is not going to learn, right? So you can see that that same motivation could bring you to a good place, and it can bring you to a bad place, right? So that's the idea. You can use your Yetzer Hara for bad, and you can use your Yetzer Hara for good. It's the same impulse. I don't want to be embarrassed, right? So that's something. Remember when David HaMelech, in the book of Shmuel, when the Aron HaKodesh is being brought into Yerushalayim. There's no Beis HaMikdash yet, but it's going to be in a tent in Yerushalayim. So David HaMelech is dancing and cavorting and doing all sorts of things. And his wife, Michal, looks from the window, Shaul's daughter, his wife, and she despises it. She says, you're acting like a child, you're acting like a servant. He says, this is not dignified. A king has to be dignified. A king has to be respectable. And David HaMelech said that for the glory of God, everything is good. So Michal took this idea of kavod and applied it in an inappropriate way, right? So that's giving into that Yetzer Hara. I'm sorry, did you want to say? Yeah.
Yeah, so when it comes to, let's say, the conservative / reform yeshivas where they have learning, and perhaps they take Tanakh or Talmud and they misinterpret it on purpose for their social justice reasons, could that be an issue of the Shema issue, or is it because they're Tinuk Shadishba might be?
Yeah, so that's the thing. That's where you get into a loaded term. They misinterpret it on purpose. You know, it's hard to describe it that way because misinterpret on purpose means I know this is untrue, but I'm going to say it. If I believe it's true, even though I'm an idiot for whatever it would be, that would be like a tinok shenishba, So it's complicated, but this is the basic idea of serving God with your Yetzer Hara. Your Yetzer Hara can be a very significant motivator, and if you have certain urges, so on one hand, al derech hamusar, you try to conquer it and go beyond it, but then you also have to ask yourself, are there positive ways that I can use these tendencies? Another example, let's say a person is a little kind of hyperactive. I don't mean technically, whatever. It's hard for them to sit still. So you might think to yourself, well, okay, maybe I'll be the one that buys the food for the Oneg Shabbases or the Mishmors or the Malava Malka, meaning I'll use my energy to kind of do good things. Okay, instead of just using my energy to go crazy or whatever it will be, I'll use my energy to contribute in some ways. So you got to figure out that even those things that are on some level negative are actually positive. So all of this, you see how all of this is built into the Zohar. The Yetzer Tov is for you, the Yetzer Hara is to use it for your wife, and that would apply by analogy to all of these different categories of Shalol Lishma. By the way, one other final thing that Rav Chaim Volozhiner says, a very fascinating thing. He says, Mitoch Shalol Lishma, Ba Lishma, by learning Torah Shalol Lishma, you come to Lishma. He says, this is not only the consequence, this has to be part of your intention. That when I learn Torah Shalol Lishma, I should intend that I am hoping to come to a level of Lishma. So it's built into your mental kavana. If you simply don't have that as a goal, then maybe that's not going to work at all. Yeah.
There's no way to say that line that the Yetzer Hara was invented for your wife is to say that your wife has a better time using the Yetzer Hara, ideas that women are more like din or something like that.
Oh, you're saying, in other words, it was created for. Well, yeah, but that would explain your wife's Yetzer Hara. The desire is trying to explain you have a Yetzer Hara for your wife. Now remember, the Gemara in Yuma makes the exact point. The Gemara in Yuma, if you remember, shortly after the second Beis HaMikdash was rebuilt, or was built, so the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the 120 elders, which included Ezra, Mordechai, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, 120 Nevi'im, or elders, many of whom were Nevi'im still. So they decided to ask Hashem for a very extraordinary intervention. And that is that the Yetzer Hara of idolatry was so powerful that they asked Hashem to take it away. Pretty amazing, because the one thing God doesn't want to take away is Yetzer Haras, because that's how we have free will. We struggle. To simply take away a Yetzer Hara kind of makes it pretty easy. But they fasted for 3 days. Hashem took away the Yetzer Hara of idolatry. Maybe later we'll talk about that a little bit. But so they were surprised. See, it's Masha, they themselves were surprised. Wow, Hashem just took it away. That's why we don't feel this urge to bow down to idols so much. So then they figured, wow, pretty good. Let's try for another one. Let's take away the Yetzer Hara of Giloy Arayos. And that was taken away too. People had no desire. What happened was, people were not getting married, people were not having children. It says chickens were not laying eggs, whatever, the whole world got makulko. So they realized that certain aspects of a Yetzer Hara are needed so the world will function. And that's a particular example there, which is really mirrors the Zohar's example, that the Yetzer Hara was created tzarech ishtay. But as I say, you can generalize it to all sorts of things. A world without a Yetzer Hara, there would not be medical research. Once again, all sorts of things. That you need this ego to push a person in the direction of creativity, productivity, and the like. Okay, so the way this works is the following. Again, the Ramak was painted in a corner and he has to get himself out of it, and that is, the whole thesis of Tomer Devorah is we should imitate what a sphera represents, so the light of that sphera will be actualized. Okay. Problem? But Gevura is what you don't want. So we can't really say, engage in Gevura behaviors so you'll have more Gevura. Because you don't want that result, right? So how do we connect the idea of emulation to Gevura? So here's what the Ramak says. And this idea he said many, many times. Gevura itself comes in two forms. Just like there's bitter chocolate and sweet chocolate, whatever it is. What do they call it, bitter chocolates? Dark chocolate, yeah. So there's strong Gevura, and there's Gevuros mimutakos, sweetens Gevura. We need Gevura. We need Gevura in the world, because Gevura represents boundaries. Gevura represents constriction. God's chesed is too overwhelming a light for us to receive unless it is limited and confined in some ways. So, instead of looking at Gevura as punishment, Gevura is withholding, limiting. When it's too strong, then we're missing God's light. When it's too weak, we're overwhelmed by the light. Sweetened Gevuros are exactly what you need so that the chesed gets niskaleh, but it's contained, it's not too strong for me, for the world, for the universe, to absorb. And that's why Gevura is a very positive thing. Remember, Gevura is feminine, because the Zachor deposits the seed out of which life comes. But the Gevura within the woman's body, it takes shape. It has boundaries. It has limits. Otherwise, it would just be an amorphous blob. So, what you want is, you do need to bring Gevura into the world. But you want to bring the Gevura into the world in a sweetened form, and not in its dark chocolate form. So here's the concept. God created a system where every time you follow the Yetzer Hara, right? The Yetzer Hara has a direct connection to Gevura. You're Meisef Gevura into the world. right? The Yetzer Hara correlates to the Gevuros. But so now it depends. If I use the Yetzer Hara in a bad way, that brings in the strong Gevuros of judgment, punishment, or constriction, and withholding of God's light. But once I understand, I can use the Yetzer Hara to serve Hashem, then once again, the Yetzer Hara turns on the Gevura faucet. That's the correlation that can never break. But it turns on the Gevura faucet in a way that enhances the chesed of Hashem, rather than limits it. And it gives me Gevuros mimutakos, the Gevuros that are sweetened. Okay, so again, based on the Zohar, this is kind of the idea. And what we walk away with in a practical level is use your Yetzer Hara in positive ways, and that will bring Gevura into the world. It will bring it. It's inevitable that there will be Gevura. In other words, Yetzer Hara equals Gevuros. That correlation is never broken. But how you're using Yetzer Hara will determine if the Gevuros are strong or the Gevuros are sweetened. And therefore, the idea would be, use your Yetzer Hara in positive ways. Yeah.
Is there then a third possibility for Devorah? By repressing the Yetzer Hara, the act of repression is a Gevura action. So would that be yet a third? Yeah.
So I think I think that is a good point. The Ramak doesn't. Well, it's a little ambiguous. The lashon in Perek Vav is not as clear. The concept would be, I repress the Yetzer Hara, I hold back the Yetzer Hara. See, here's where I have a little bit of a problem. I think there the correlation would be, when I repress the Yetzer Hara, so Hashem represses the Gevuros. Which could be good also. You're not going to be flooded with Gevuros Chazakos. But I'm not sure if repression of Gevura is the same process as sweetening of Gevura. See, there's a difference there.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so.
Huh?
I wouldn't think so.
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing. I'm not sure if repressing the Yetzer Hara will result in sweetened Gevuros. I guess that's the question that we need to think about. You're saying you think not. Okay. Yeah, but that would be the difference. Masha'en Kain, when I give in to the Yetzer Hara, but I direct it in good ways, that brings the Gevura force into the world. Of course, that raises an interesting conundrum. It's almost as if you need Shalom Lishma people. I mean, let's imagine every single person in the world was serving Hashem only Lishma. So nobody's using their Yetzer Hara. So it turns out you don't have any factor that brings Gevuros Mamutakos into the world. You simply have no mechanism to trigger Gevura at all, and then you got a problem of being overwhelmed with Chesed. Unless you're going to say, once we all become Lishma, our capacity to absorb the Chesed is greater. We can absorb more at that point. But that's an interesting bit of a brain teaser to think about. Okay, so that's the basic. So really, that's all I wanted to say about Perek Vav, the concept of Gevuros Mimutakos, the concept of the Yetzer Hara was created for your wife, how to understand that in serving Hashem with your Yetzer Hara, and that will be the trigger to the Gevura that you need. Gevura is an essential vitamin in spiritual life. Without Gevura, the Chesed would destroy us, quite literally. I'll just end with Balatanya. Balatanya, after Chelek Aleph, there's a short little essay. It's not even a designated part of Tanya. It's called Chinuch Katan. And he says, the pasuk like this. The pasuk says in Tehillim, Ki Shemesh Umagein Hashem Elokim. Hashem is Yud Kei Vav Kei. God is the sun and the shield. So says the Alter Rebbe very beautifully, the sun is the light of God, the warmth of God, the chesed of God. But if that chesed doesn't have a sunscreen or an umbrella, what do you get? You get sunburn or skin cancer. So God has to give you a shield, a blocking, something that blocks the full rays of the sun, just like sun. So Hashem is both the Shemesh and the Magen. Hashem Elokim. Yud Kei Vav Kei is the Rachamim, or the Chesed. Elokim is the Din. So the way it works is, Yud Kei Vav Kei is the Shemesh, and Elokim is the Magen. Right? That's the need for Gevura in the world. Okay, we'll stop here.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome Ech production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.